V'daber Hashem el Moshe Lemor. Dabrel b'nei Yisrael v'yoshuvu v'yachdu l'fnei pi achiros. You should speak to the Yisrael, and they should return and camp before Pi Achiros. This location called Pi Achiros, Bein Migdol Bein Hayom. It's between a location called Migdol and the sea. Lifnei Baal Tzafon, before the Lord of the North. Nicho, opposite Tachnu Al Hayom. Opposite, you should camp by the sea. So he's telling them to travel in the direction of the enemy rather than flee from the enemy. And it should appear that the reason why they seem to be confused is because the Baal Tzafon, which is the last deity of Egypt, which Hashem did not destroy, is still in place. So Rashi himself explains, why did he tell them to travel in the opposite direction? Lachareim, Letzad Mitzrayim, Hoyim Mekarvim Kol Yom Shlishi. The third day, they were getting closer to the enemy. Rather than flee from the enemy, they were getting closer to the enemy. They lahatos as Paro, to deceive Paro, Sheyomar, that he should say, Toam Him Baderech. They're lost on the way. Moshenem of Omer Paro of Yisrael, as we'll see in a moment, Paro says about the Jewish people that they're locked into the desert. Because the Baal Tzafon, that deity is still in place, and that deity is the deity of the Egyptians. God was not able to destroy it. Therefore, the Jews are locked into the desert. We still have our hold on them. Lefnei Baal Tzafon, Rashi, less Rashi on the page, Hu Nisha Mikol Elohei Mitzrayim. Of all the deities of Egypt that were destroyed, the only deity that was not destroyed was the Lord of the North, the La'atos and Shema Koshi Rosam, to mislead them that they should say that their belief, their deity is powerful, is emboldened, and therefore God cannot destroy this deity. Eov says that God misleads the nations to destroy them. Again, as we said, at the time of the Borod, Paro had believed initially that since everything was being destroyed, there are no holdbacks, God is the supreme being. All deities are therefore only manifestations of God's will. But when he realized that the spelt and the wheat crop was not destroyed, he said, if God is that omnipotent being, why didn't he destroy the wheat and spelt? Evidently, the wheat and spelt are independent of God. So meaning, God is only a power as the other powers. If he would have destroyed everything, that would have indicated that he is in total control. Everything's under his dominance because he wills everything. But if the wheat and spelt was not destroyed, that tells us that God is not the omnipotent being. So we explained then, but then the arba comes, the locusts come, and they eat the wheat and spelt. So he realized then that he was mistaken. But now, after everything's said and done, at the time of Max Bechoros, over there, what does it say in the Torah? Ubelahei Mitzrayim Eseh Shvatim, I'll be judgment on the deities of Egypt. And as I mentioned yesterday, it was made of stone, it shattered, it was made of wood, it rotted, and it was made of metal, it melted, meaning these were representations of those deities. So when the deity was destroyed, or was rendered powerless, its representation totally disintegrated. So, but now that the Lord of the North was not destroyed, and we see it's still empowered because the Jews are locked in the desert, again, this tells us that God is not the all-controlling being. There's a power independent of God. So God is not who Moshe said he is. Okay? But you realize, as much as he may not be, but if you lost 10 out of 10, and Egypt has been reduced to rubble, and all the firstborn and plus were killed, according to their understanding, in one swoop, you have to be insane to get involved with this power, because ultimately you can be destroyed. So the Torah tells us soon, why was he able to go after the Jews? Again, God hardened his heart. He hardened his heart. If not to the hardening of the heart, he wouldn't have gone after this position, because it's so irrational, it's so insane, he wouldn't have relied on this. So therefore he needed the hardening of the heart to rely on this point, that if God didn't destroy the Lord of the North, that tells me he's not the all-powerful, because we see there's a power independent of him. Just a simple understanding, but I want to make this point. It's very interesting. According to Rambam asked the question, if the objective of life is choice, and therefore we're either deserving for making the right choice, or we're liable and culpable for making the wrong choice, because it was only our own initiative which brought about the right or the wrong. So he asks, why was Paro culpable after the fifth plague? He had no bechira, he had no choice. That was Rambam's question. So Rambam answered that after the fifth plague, Hashem withdrew his choice, but until the fifth plague he had choice. So it was his choice not to have choice. That because he abused the privilege of choice, his decision to behave as he did was the cause of the withdrawal of the choice. So you no longer have choice. That's the Rambam. So I asked the question, which is an obvious question. We find as the plagues continue, the Torah tells us God hardened his heart. But if God already had withdrawn his choice, what do we need? A continuous hardening of his heart. But we find continuously, as the plagues go, again, God hardened his heart, therefore he was oblivious to the plague. And he was stiff-necked. Now again, after the 10th plague, they pursue him, the Jews, into the sea. God hardens his heart. What do we need? This continuous hardening of the heart if Hashem already had withdrawn his free choice? That was a question that always bothered me. So we had said in the past that a person at a certain level, you have choice, God withdraws your free choice. What about the next level? God's presence is undeniably obvious. As a result of that, based on the level of withdrawal of choice before, now when God presents himself in a more obvious way, the withdrawal of choice at the previous level is not sufficient that he shouldn't recognize who God is at the new level, at the more obvious level. So when we speak about God withdrawing his choice, it's not he had no control over himself. He relied on certain levels of irrationality. But the question is, how irrational are you? So as the plagues progressed, you had to rely on something to be more irrational. But after the 10th plague, and you have one thing to rely on, something at that level, based on the withdrawal of choice previously, that's not enough to rely on that one ace up your sleeve, that the Lord of the North. So again, because that did exist, there's a new level of withdrawal of choice, because to rely on this, you have to be irrational to a greater degree. So therefore, you needed a new withdrawal of choice. Therefore, God continuously withdraws choice at the various levels of his obviousness. That's why you have to have a continuous withdrawal of choice. That's how we explained it. Because we're going to see in a moment, even when he's going after them, he says, I'm going, and he has to get the people to go. God may have withdrawn your choice, but the people are not insane. But they have a reason to go after the Jews, because they took their personal effects. They took their gold and silver vessels. They took everything. But you know something? But if it's a suicide mission, and probably we're not coming back. We're not going after the Jews. So at that point, we need a new hardening of choice, because at that level, it's more literally bordering on insanity. You have to rely on something which is so infinitesimal, reliable. Anybody who has any relevance to being rational wouldn't do this. Therefore, we needed that extensive, advanced level of hardening to even rely on that to go after the Jews. That's how we explained it. Just in the moment. V'amar Paro livnei Yisrael. Paro says about the Jewish people, Nevuchim heim ba'aretz. They are locked into the land. Sogalem midbar. The desert has closed upon them. That's his observation. And Hashem says to Moshe, V'chizakti es leif Paro. I will harden his heart. So what would this hardening of the heart cause? V'rodav achreim. And because of that new level of hardening, he's going to pursue them. V'kovda b'Pharaoh v'chol chelo. And I will become glorified through Paro and all his armies. V'yoda Mitzrayim kinei Hashem. And then Egypt will know that I am God. Meaning, till now, they could say, this one deity left. But after the Egyptians pursue the Jews and they're going to be destroyed, Egypt will know that I am God. The question, which Egypt? It simply means the Egyptians back in excuse me. What happened? What happened? Okay. Okay. Take a look at Rashi Daled. He koved up Mitzrayim from the word kovod. Shakadosh Baruch Hu misnakim b'Yerushalayim. When God takes revenge against the evil, Shmo mizgadol miskabed. His name is elevated and glorified. Kach Omer. And as the pasuk says in Yecheskel, "V'nishpateti ito," I will go to judgment with him. V'akach v'skadalti, v'skadishti v'nodati. I'll become greater. I'll become sanctified. I'll become known. First, I will be glorified through Paro and his armies. He says, because he's the one who initiated this evil. Mimenu hischila paranus. So therefore, the punishment began with him, the hardening of the heart. And what does the Torah say? V'yasu came. The Jews listened. There was no refusal. They traveled towards the enemy. Although it seemed to be almost putting your head in the mouth of the lion, you had to have a very special level of trust to be able to travel in the opposite direction. So Rashi says, L'hagid shvochem, to speak of the praiseworthiness of the Jewish people, sheshamu l'kol Moshe, that they listened to the word of Moshe, v'lo omru, hech karev el rodfeinu, how do we get closer to the one who's pursuing us? Anu tzrichel nevroach, we have to flee. El omru, ein lonu el divri ben Amram. All we follow are the words of Ben Amram. Moshe, Ben Amram. You find it very interesting. Here, when they refer to Ben Amram, it's as an expression of love. We follow Ben Amram. Later, when they come and they question Moshe, at the time of Korach, they refer to Moshe as Ben Amram. Somebody would say, Cohn said, Goldstein said. I mean, you call a person by his first name. So it could be a little disrespectful, or it could also be endearing. When you refer to somebody by like the son of Amram rather by his own name, it's like an endearing expression. Over here, it's like endearing. They said all we listened to was Ben Amram. I think it's Chazal could have said, they could have said, we follow the words, the dictate of Moshe. What's the Ben Amram? So in this context, I think, what is Ben Amram? We find that, as you remember, the only tribe that did not agree to be conscripted, who did not reveal their capability, their capacity, was Shevet Levi. Why? Because Amram, the father of Moshe Rabbeinu, was the leading Torah sage of the generation, and he advised them, do not show the Egyptians your capacity, your capability. All the tribes heard what he said, but they didn't listen. Shevet Levi was the only one who listened, and therefore they were kept out of the bondage. We only have the words of Ben Amram, meaning in retrospect, Amram was right 100%. If the Jews would have never shown that they had the capacity to produce the bricks or whatever it was, they wouldn't have been conscripted at that time. Ein lanu ela ben Amram. We have the words, what Amram's telling us is absolutely correct. Although it seems to be contrary to rational behavior, it's Ben Amram. So therefore, in this context, endearing, rather than referring to Moshe as Moshe, Moshe could be questioned. But in retrospect, Ben Amram was right without a question. Of course, Levi was never in the Shibud, and Amram saw their machinations and how they plotted to enslave the Jews. Therefore, even traveling towards the enemy is the right thing to do.